Then, whilst a non-commissioned officer collected the squads for the action on foot, I ran as far as the furthest houses of the village to reconnoitre the ground and get orders. I spied Major P. in a sheltered nook, still mounted, and he told me of his anxiety about the situation. The enemy riflemen were invisible and were riddling the outskirts of the village, while we were unable to reply, and some guns had been seen which were being got into position. He advised me to go and see the captain of the first squadron, who had been ordered to defend that entrance of the village, and to place myself at his disposal in case of need. Whilst we were talking, my troop, led by its non-commissioned officer, came to the place where we were, edging along by the walls. The men, calm and smiling, with their carbines ready, waited in silence for the signal to advance. I signed to them to wait a little longer, and then, going round the wall, I found myself suddenly in the thick of the fray. I must say the reception I got startled me. The bullets came rattling in hundreds, chipping the walls and cutting branches from the trees. On our side there was absolute silence. Our men, on their knees or lying flat behind any cover they could find, did not reply, as they could see nothing, and waited stoically under the shower of bullets until their adversaries chose to advance. I looked for Captain D.L., who commanded the first squadron. There he was, standing with his face to the enemy and his hands in his pockets, quietly giving his orders to a non-commissioned officer. On my asking if he wanted me, he explained the situation. The enemy, numbers unknown, was occupying the woods overlooking Jaulgonne to the east. It was impossible for us to debouch just yet. The essential thing was to hold the village, and consequently the bridge, until our infantry could come up. He told me that the first troop of my squadron, led by Lieutenant d'A., had just advanced in extended order into the vineyards, orchards and fields stretching between the road and the river. He was going to reconnoitre the woods and see what kind of force was holding it. "You see, dear fellow, for the present I don't want the help of your carbines. I have my whole squadron here, and they can't get a shot. So long as the enemy sticks to the wood, all we can do is wait and keep our powder dry." I put my troop under shelter in a small yard, and directed my non-commissioned officer to keep in touch with me, in case I might want him. Then I went back to the outskirts of the village to examine the ground. I then joined my friend S. behind a large heap of faggots. He commanded the nearest troop of the first squadron, and we could not help laughing at the curious situation, being formed up for battle, fronting the enemy, under a hail of bullets, and not able to see anything. During the campaign S. had become a philosopher, and he deserved some credit for it, for the great moral and physical sufferings we had endured must have been still more insupportable to him than to any of us. In the regiment S. was considered pre-eminently the society officer. He went to all the receptions, all the afternoon teas, all the bridge parties, all the dinners. He was an adept at tennis and golf and a first-rate shot. His elegance was proverbial, and the beautiful cut of his tunics, breeches, jackets and coats was universally admired. The way his harness was kept and the shape of his high boots were a marvel. To say all this is to give some idea of the change he suddenly experienced in his habits and in his tastes during these demoralising days of retreat and merciless hours of pursuit. But in spite of it all, he had kept his good humour and never lost his gay spirits. He still accompanied his talk with elaborate gestures, and seemed to be just as much at ease behind the heap of wood, bombarded with bullets, as in the best appointed drawing-room. His clothes were stained and patched. His beard had begun to grow, and yet under this rough exterior the polished man of the world could always be divined. He explained the beginnings of the affair with perfect clearness and self-possession, how the scouts sent up to the ridge by d'A. and driven off by the Germans had fallen back upon Jaulgonne, how the first squadron had come to barricade and defend the village, and in what anxiety they were, wanting to know what had become of d'A.'s troop, which had started out to reconnoitre the wood. We hoisted ourselves to the top of the faggot stack and peeped over carefully. The glaring white road wound up the flank of the slope between the fields dotted with apple trees. At a distance of 800 yards in front of us stretched the dark border of the wood, and from which the fusillade was coming. To our right, at the edge of the water, on the road leading to Marcilly, F. must have been able to see the enemy, for we could distinctly hear the crackle of his carbines. Our attention was drawn to a man of F.'s troop running along under the wall, bending almost double to escape the attention of the sniper and endeavouring to screen himself behind the high grass. As soon as he came near enough, we called out: "What is it?" "The lieutenant has sent me to say that the enemy has just placed some guns in position up there, in the opening of the wood." Saying which, he pointed vaguely in a direction where we could see nothing. However, we knew that F. would not have warned us if he had not been quite certain of the fact. So for some unpleasant minutes we wondered what the enemy's objective was. We longed to know at once where the projectiles were going to burst. Would it be on F.'s troop, or on the bridge, or on the infantry which, perhaps, were beginning to debouch, or perhaps on that portion of the brigade that had remained dismounted on the left bank, drawn up for action? The uncertainty was worse than the danger itself, but we were not long in doubt. 2 shrieks of flying shells, 2 explosions about 300 yards in front of us, 2 puffs of white smoke rising above the green fields. This showed they had an objective we had not considered, namely d'A.'s troop, for the shrapnel had burst in the direction he had just taken with his men. Our anxiety did not last long. We soon made out our Chasseurs, coming back quietly, not running, and in good order. They took to the ditch, a fairly deep one which ran along the left side of the road, and covered them up to the middle. The German shells were badly aimed, and exploded either in front of them or higher up on the hillside. But our anxiety became more intense every minute. Had a shell fallen on the road or in the ditch, we should have seen those brave fellows knocked over, mown down, cut to pieces by the hail of bullets. When we're fighting ourselves, we hardly have time to think about our neighbours in this way. We have our own cares, and our first thought is for the safety of the men who form our little family, the troop. But when one is safe, or fairly so, it is torture to watch comrades advancing under the enemy's fire without any protection. At that moment the Germans were concentrating their fire upon the small line of men we were looking at, 200 yards away from us. The shells succeeded one another uninterruptedly, but without any greater precision. We watched our friends coming nearer until they had almost reached our barricade, and noticed that 2 of the Chasseurs were being supported by their comrades. In our anxiety we got up out of our shelter, but d'A. shouted: "It's nothing, only scratches." At last they got in, and whilst our good and indefatigable Assistant Sergeant P. took charge of the wounded men, we pressed round the officer and questioned him as to what he had seen. "Are there many of them? Was there any infantry?" we asked. But his daring reconnaissance had not been very fruitful. He had had to stop when the artillery had opened fire on him, and had not been able to see how many adversaries we had to deal with. Acting on the advice of Major P., our captain, who had just rejoined us with the 3rd Troop, gave us orders to mount. We were only in the way here, where there were too many defenders already, so recrossed the bridge to put ourselves at the Colonel's disposal. I led with my troop, and we passed through Jaulgonne by the main street. The inhabitants thought we were beating retreat, and became uneasy. Some women uttered cries, begging us not to leave them at the mercy of the enemy. We had to calm them by saying that they need not fear, that we were still holding the Germans, that our infantry would soon arrive, and that in an hour the foe would have decamped. To tell the truth, we were not quite so sure of it ourselves. The enemy were in some force, and he had guns. Our infantry had at least 15 kilometres to march before their advance guard could debouch on the bridge at Jaulgonne. If they had not started before dawn, they could not arrive before 11 o'clock, and it was then barely 9. The German artillery was already beginning to fire upon the village. Suddenly, as we reached the market-place, we saw a group of 3 dismounted Chasseurs emerging from an alley that ran steeply down the Marne. They belonged to F.'s troop. 2 of them were supporting the 3rd, whom we at once recognised. It was Laurent, a fine fellow, and a favourite with the whole squadron. It went to our hearts to see him. His left eye was nothing but a red patch, from which blood was flowing freely, drenching his clothing. He was moaning softly, and, blinded by the blood, allowed himself to be led like a child. The corporal with him explained: "A bullet went in just over his eye. I don't know if the eye itself was hit." The captain sprang off his horse. "Cheer up, Laurent. It shall be attended to at once. Perhaps it will be nothing, my man. Come with me. We will take you to the Red Cross ambulance close by." Then, between his groans, the wounded man said a thing I shall not easily forget. "Mon capitaine, haven't they taken away their guns yet?" He still had an interest in the battle. I heard afterwards that F. had sighted the German guns, and that the fire of his troop had been directed upon them. Laurent would have liked to hear that they had been driven away.